Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I will be discussing Stephen King's most overrated books, at least in my opinion. And y'all better buckle up because I've got some unpopular Stephen King opinions to unload and unleash on y'all, so be prepared for that. So if you haven't seen my previous video, kind of what I'm doing is this is going to be a 3-video series. The first book, which I published last week, uploaded last week, was my opinions on Stephen King's most underrated books. So you'll see my most underrated Stephen King book opinions there. And in this episode, I'm going to be diving deep into some unpopular opinions, my overrated Stephen King opinions. And then next week will actually be something new and interesting called properly hyped Stephen King books. The books that I believe are properly hyped. So the general consensus is that they're either bad or that they're good or pretty good. But for this one, overrated, I have a lot of opinions to unleash on y'all. So I'm going to try to start out with like the least egregious options and then work my way up to the most egregious. And what I mean by that is like, you know, like if you are starting out like the first couple of books that I'm like, oh man, this guy has terrible taste. Like, well, guess what? You're going to have to buckle up because these opinions, they're a little dicey. I might lose subscribers over this, but it's all just my subjective opinion. I'm just a dumb booktuber. Like, these are my silly opinions. So if you want to join me here, feel free to comment down below how you feel, how you dislike my opinions. Go right ahead. With all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I think probably the least egregious of these picks, I think I have like 10 books to talk about here. I think the least egregious is Under the Dome. And the reason I consider this overrated is that it is one of Stephen King's most popular books, at least in his newer books, like books that he's released in the last 20 years or so. A lot of people know about this book. A lot of people know the general story. A lot of people do really like this book. And it got made into a semi-popular TV series. But generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of this book. Specifically because of the ending. I think it's one of Stephen King's most dumb, just stupidest endings. But also, it's just way too long. And you'll get a similar vibe to a lot of these books. I generally like Stephen King novellas and short books. When he gets past a certain length, a lot of the times just feel like it's overbloated. And this book definitely feels like that. A lot of this book could have been cut out or trimmed down. But yeah, overall, this book is good. I don't hate this book. And generally speaking, for the rest of this list, I like a lot of these books. I enjoy most of these books. It's not that I hate any of these books. I just think they're overrated. And that's kind of the same deal with Under the Dome. Like, it's good. Like, it's more like a 3.5 star book. But it's not one of his best. But a lot of people do really like it. And it's one of his most popular books. So for that, I think it's overrated. Another one of his newer books that actually came out in the last, I don't know, like 5 years or so. A lot of people I see love this book. And definitely when we're talking about like new Stephen King, a lot of people really enjoyed their time with this book. But for me, I thought it was just fine. It was okay. And that would be The Institute. Now, I kind of have a weird opinion here. Like, I loved the first chapter of this book where we get introduced to this kind of random guy. And then we don't see him again for like 300 pages. I'm like, what? I was enjoying that guy. But for a lot of people who love this book, they love the kid characters. And this is kind of all about this institute kidnapping kid characters who seemingly have kind of these weird supernatural powers and abilities, and they're doing testing on them. And they're basically trying to figure out how to get out of here and to get themselves free. So a lot of people love that section. I'm just kind of okay on that. I really liked the main character at the beginning, and then he gets kind of introduced later on, and I liked it more with him. It's also got kind of a weird ending that I didn't really fully understand. But again, a lot of people love this book. For me, it's just okay. So for that reason, I do think it is slightly overrated. In my previous video of underrated books, I mentioned a few collections that I really feel are underrated. Now, the collection that I feel is probably the most overrated would be Skeleton Crew. Now, the first time I read this, I absolutely loved it. But then when I went back and reread it, it was like, what's the saying? Like rose tinted glasses. Like, I remembered loving every short story in here. But from my reread, I was just like, oh yeah, it's got like 5 or 6 like really standout short stories in the Mist novella. But then the rest of them are kind of just either bad or forgettable or just kind of okay. So overall, it's a very unbalanced collection. Like it's got top tier Stephen King stories. Like you've obviously got The Mist, you've got Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, you've got The Raft, you've got Survivor Type, you've got The Jaunt. It's like really outstanding short stories. But then you've got other stuff like Here There Be Tigers, The Wedding Gig. You've got a couple of poems in here, and Stephen King's not good with poems. You know, you've got a few that are just bad and forgettable and just, not great. So overall, this is a very unbalanced Stephen King collection. But a lot of people still cite this as top tier. Like, a lot of people say this is their favorite collection, which for me, I don't understand. Like, Night Shift is just hands down the best short story collection. For me, this one is definitely overrated. Next up, I'm going to turn to the Dark Tower series. In my previous video, I mentioned one of these was, I feel, very underrated. But for this one, can you take a guess at which one do I think is the most overrated? I will say I thought about picking Wizard and Glass, but for me, it's still top tier Dark Tower, so I kind of feel bad about saying that's overrated, although a lot of people, that is their favorite, but for me, it's still 2 and 3 of the best. But I'm not going to pick Wizard and Glass. I'm actually going to pick the finale. So book 7, The Dark Tower. I feel that this is overrated because a lot of people, when they talk about this book, they talk about the very ending of the book. And while it is Stephen King like wrapping up the Dark Tower series in a very brilliant way, like it's one of the best endings that's ever been written in a fantasy series by Stephen King. It's just a really outstanding ending. But what a lot of people don't talk about is the buildup in that book. There's a lot of stuff that happens in that book that I'm not the biggest fan of. A lot of anticlimactic moments. And just overall, in the series totality, it's one of my least favorites just because it's 1,000 pages. And while it does have some great moments, including the very ending, overall, it is one of my least favorites. And I do think it is slightly overrated. All right, now we're going to be getting into the territory where y'all are probably not going to like my choices here. But again, I enjoy all of these books to varying degrees. So I don't hate any of these books. But just know that I think they're overrated and that there are, in my opinion, a lot better Stephen King books. So the next one, I think, out of the 6 that I have left, this is probably the least egregious. But a lot of people love this book. So we'll see. I'm, of course, talking about Salem's Lot, which is Stephen King's vampire novel. And for me, main reason why it's on this list is I'm not the biggest vampire fan. This is one of my favorite vampire novels. My favorite would probably be Fever Dream by my boy George R.R. Martin. That's my favorite, and this one's a close second. But again, it's not one of my favorite Stephen King books, simply because it's his second published novel. The characters aren't the best. Like, he has much better characters later on in his career. And even before with Carrie has great characters. But Salem's Lot, the characters are fine. Vampire stuff doesn't normally work for me. It works fine in here. It's kind of a 4-star horror book. And a lot of people love this book. Like, this is top 10, like top tier Stephen King horror. I will admit it's definitely one of the creepiest books Stephen King has ever written. But for me, it's not one of his best. So for that reason, it does make my overrated list. Next up, I did a rant review for this maybe like a year or 2 ago, and I got a lot of flack for it because a lot of people just love this book. A lot of people cite this as their favorite, the scariest book Stephen King has ever written, but for me, it's just overrated. I give it 3 stars. One of my least favorite books out of the books I'm talking about here. And that would, of course, be Pet Sematary. Ugh. I did do a rant review for this because it's just very overrated, and I go into more detail about why I think it's overrated in that video, so definitely check it out. But basically, there's just a couple of things about this book that really irk me. He kind of spoils a major event of this book before it actually happens. I really don't like when Stephen King does that. I think it's just stupid. I also have probably an unpopular opinion that this book was told in the wrong POV. I like Lewis Creed, but I think that it would have been more interesting told from his wife, Rachel's POV. I think that would have been extra creepy because she's all about not getting along with death very well, and he's kind of more clinical and analytical about it. So I don't know. There's just a lot of stuff about this book that I don't love, and I definitely think it's one of Stephen King's most overrated horror books ever. Next up, this book, in my opinion, is overrated, although it is still an all-time classic for a reason. I have reread this book several times. I do enjoy it, although I do enjoy the sequel a lot more, so you guys can probably guess what it is by now. I'm, of course, talking about The Shining. Now, I will admit, the first time I read this book, absolutely loved it. Gave it 5 stars, and then I jumped into the sequel, Doctor Sleep, which at that time was just a new release, and that I was just like, whoa, this is crazy. And I liked it. I gave it 4 stars. But every time that I go to reread them, because when I reread these books, I do them back to back just because I like that experience. I like The Shining less and less, and I like Doctor Sleep more and more. So in a way, Doctor Sleep is somewhat underrated, although, maybe not. The Shining, I just think it's slightly overrated just because, I don't know, like I mentioned, every time I read this book, I just enjoy it less and less. Maybe I should have had this a little bit, well, no, because people love this book. What am I talking about? But yeah, a lot of people cite this as his best horror book, and a lot of people put this in their top 5, their top 10. It's got one of the more intriguing villains of all time in Jack Torrance, so I get why people love this book. But for me, there's just a lot more Stephen King that I enjoy more, including the sequel, Doctor Sleep, which, unpopular opinion there. But yeah, The Shining, overrated, but still great. These next 3 books, generally like 3 of Stephen King fans' most favorite books. And for me, they're all overrated, and one of the main factors in all of these is the length. I don't love Stephen King tomes and 1,000-page books. Like I already mentioned with Under the Dome, but that one, out of these like 4 tomes, that's kind of like people's least favorite. But these 3 books people love. And I like all of them, and I really like one of them, but I still think they're overrated. So, and I don't really even know what order to put these in because they're all obnoxious. They're all egregious picks because y'all are going to be like, that book is great. That book is amazing. What are you talking about? So I think that I'll go in order of like what I think is least overrated to more overrated. So this next book I really do enjoy, but I think it is overrated, and that would be It. So I know y'all are screaming at me because y'all love It. I really enjoy this book. I think it's a 4-star experience. Some of the best character work Stephen King has ever done. I really enjoy the Losers Club. Obviously one of the most iconic villains of all time in Pennywise. But for me, it's just too damn long. It's over bloated. The scenes in here just go on unnecessarily long. I think at this point in Stephen King's career, like, his editor just isn't really doing much. Like, he'll just turn in a book and like, oh yeah, Stephen King's best-selling author. He'll just write whatever he wants to and we'll publish it. And it just suffers because of that. And also there's a couple of things towards the end that I don't really love. And then there's a weird otherworldly thing about this book that I think is just kind of silly that I don't love. So it is a great book, very iconic for a reason. And I do enjoy going back to read it. But it's just overbloated and not really a book that I would ever put in my top 10 or really even my top 20. But it's still iconic for a reason. I just think there's better Stephen King books out there. So, yeah, it's overrated. And then these 2 books are overrated. I give both of these books 3 stars. I enjoy them a lot less than I do It. And let's just go ahead and jump right into it and kill some of y'all's love for me. 11/22/63, man. So many people love this book. Every person that I've seen like read this book gives it like 4 or 5 stars, including my wife, whose favorite is Dolores Claiborne. That's her all-time favorite. But she read this book, and I wasn't sure what she would think about it, but she gave it like either 4.5 or 5 stars. Like even she loved it, and she's not a big Stephen King fan. So this is a book that honestly I recommend to Stephen King fans now, just because everyone except me seems to love this book. And for me, it's not only the length of the book that gets me, because it is 1,000 pages, but it's just kind of the departure from what I wanted. Like if this book would have been cut in half and just would have stuck with the concept of going back in time to prevent the JFK assassination, it would have been great, because I loved kind of the first third of this book where it's like mostly about that premise. But then you get to the middle, and I know a lot of people love this book for this reason, but for me, it just feels like an unnecessary romance side plot. That might be a gut punch to y'all, but that's how I feel. And really, the ending isn't really that great for me either. Like, this book, it's just overrated. It's one of my least favorites. Like, it's a 3-star book, and so many people love it. So for that reason, I do think it is overrated. Y'all are going to kill me. And then this next book, I just think in Stephen King's like totality of his career, like this is easily his most overrated book, because so many people cite this as a 5-star read, their all-time favorite Stephen King book, and it's been going on for decades. And I just don't get it. I don't get it. Of course, talking about The Stand, especially the uncut version. I still need to read the original version. That's only 800 pages, 100,000 words less. I think I'll have a better time with that, but even still, man, like this book, like It, does have some great characters, and like 11/22/63, it does start out very well. Like part 1 of this book is amazing. Like if it was just part 1, it'd be 5 stars easily, because it's what I wanted the book to be, like post-apocalyptic, like things are happening, like some scary shit's going on, and it's just really good, really great characters. But then you get to part 2 and part 3, and it's just it's a friggin' snooze fest. And the ending is one of the worst endings Stephen King has ever written, and I don't get it. I don't get why people love this book. I mean, I do, but at the same time, it confuses me. But yeah, definitely in Stephen King's like career, I think lately 11/22/63 is kind of becoming his most overrated. I might go back and reread this one, because I might just be wrong, but that's kind of how I felt the first time I read this. But The Stand, I don't think I'll ever get it. It's definitely his most overrated. I don't get it. All right, so that is my video for Stephen King's most overrated books. And I tried to do it kind of in order. Like the first few books, like Skeleton Crew, The Institute, Under the Dome, they're overrated, but people might not complain about that as much as kind of the top 3, really. The Stand, 11/22/63, and It. So many people love those books, but for me, they're never going to be at the top of my list. But that's why I love Stephen King, and I love talking about his books, because so many people have varying, like vastly different opinions. You know, a lot of people, like I'm probably the only person, honestly, that doesn't like 11/22. I mean, I like it, but I don't love it. I'm one of the only people who doesn't love it. But yeah, so those are my overrated books. Definitely let me know. Y'all probably disagree with me, so leave your comments down below about how much my opinions suck. If you do agree with me, leave it down below. I'd love to chat about you with that. So yeah. Also, what are your most overrated Stephen King books? I want to chat about that with y'all in the comments. And so yeah, last week, like I said, we did underrated Stephen King books. This week was overrated. The next week, we're going to be doing properly hyped Stephen King books. And what this means, and this was a fun idea Stacy came up with, is basically Stephen King books that generally most constant readers can agree it's either bad or great or pretty good. So like the general consensus is that it's this. Whereas a lot of Stephen King books, just, you know, even like my favorite, The Dead Zone, a lot of people love it. A lot of people think it's meh. And then, you know, like The Talisman, a lot of people love it. A lot of people hate it. You know, and even something like Fairy Tale that came out, a lot of people did not like it, but then a lot of people ended up loving it. So Stephen King fans can kind of be all over the place. But I tried my best to pick 10 books that like are properly hyped, like, and that I agree with also is the kind of the main component of that. Like, I agree with the general consensus because obviously, you know, freaking books like 11/22/63, it's properly hyped, but I don't agree. So there are going to be properly hyped books that I agree with. So that's kind of the main component of that. But that's next week. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you're stuck with me this far, because I know a lot of nuggety opinions in this one, but thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. If you haven't already subscribed, do so to stay tuned for more content. I also have the Bookish Drummer Discord, where we are still chugging along with the Stephen King Book Club. Our pick for March is Rose Matter, so definitely check that out if you haven't already, or if you want to reread it with us. We've got a channel open for discussion on that. And I also have my Patreon link down below if you want to support me there for as little as $1 a month, and my Amazon wishlist if you'd like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.